Have you ever driven the wrong way down a one-way street? Probably not for long, and probably by accident, if at all. But what about riding a bike the wrong way? Intentionally. Since a bike takes up a lot less space than a car or truck, it's feasible to ride against traffic on just about any street. Of course, just because you can doesn't mean you should, and in most cases, riding the wrong way will get you yelled at or honked at, and perhaps seriously injured. But what about those places where bikes are actually encouraged to swim upstream, so to speak, through signage, paint, and other bike lane infrastructure? Is that safe? Stick around and I'll sort it out for you on this episode of Point to Point. With many questions related to bike safety, the answers aren't always obvious. The safety of contraflow lanes, those specialty bike lanes that run counter to the normal flow of traffic, is no exception. If you watched my video on bike lanes a couple months ago, you know there are several primary categories of lanes, each with its own unique features and safety profile. And even within each category, there's variation. This is true of contraflow lanes as well. Each has its own unique risk elements, and while some are ideal for riders of all abilities and comfort levels, others may be better for more experienced, confident riders. So let's get into the various contraflow flavors, the reasons why these lanes are built in the first place, and the unique risks of riding in each one. These contraflow lanes exist where city planners want to consolidate two-way bike traffic on a one-way street. In downtown Chicago, Clinton on the west side of the loop, and Dearborn on the east side are prime examples of this type of contraflow lane. Both run north and south, feeding riders into the central business district where several east-west lanes could be accessed. You might be asking, why does this make more sense than simply putting separate bike lanes on separate one-way streets, staying with the direction of traffic? In some cases, this is done because the chosen street is wider or has less natural vehicle traffic than others in the area. Or the city prefers to maintain adjacent streets primarily for vehicles, rather than having bikes on every street. That seems to be the goal in Chicago. An additional benefit of pairing the two bike lanes on one side of a one-way street is that providing barrier protection takes up less space than having protection on multiple streets or on both sides of a two-way street. And in locations with winter weather, such as Chicago, a wider multi-directional lane is easier and more efficient to keep free of snow than two skinnier single-direction lanes on separate streets. Sorry, Miami, that's not a benefit for you. As to the question of safety, this is about as safe as a person could be riding in the opposite direction of vehicle traffic. Intersections have separate bike signals, and cars don't get a turn signal except when bikes have a red light. Barrier or buffer protection on some blocks increases the level of safety for the entire lane, and the contraflow part of the lane is the farthest from moving vehicles. I mean, look at this. In between wrong-way bikes in the lane of traffic, you've got the other bike lane, the barrier or buffer, and the parking lane. Compare with how close cars get in a typical painted bike lane, this is luxury. Just don't let that feeling of luxury lull you into a state of complacency. Bikes moving the opposite direction are going to be very close to you, and during rush periods there can be a lot of bike traffic. And the curb is right there too, so pedestrians can wander into the bike lane with one step. This is a good place to give your bell a friendly ring if you have one, and maybe ride a little slower here in case you need to stop quickly. These lanes are generally only contraflow for a block or two, allowing two-way bike traffic where vehicle traffic flow has been limited. They often focus on neighborhood amenities that residents would want to reach using a bike, such as parks, schools, libraries, and shopping. Rather than forcing bikes to take indirect routes, a contraflow lane can make these destinations easier to reach, encouraging less driving and more riding. In some cases, users were already riding against traffic on these streets, and new signage and paint memorialized the way the street was being used on an informal basis. Sunnyside is a great example in Chicago's North Center neighborhood, allowing bike traffic to head west for a block past Wells Park. As is frequently the case with these contraflow connectors, Sunnyside offers only sharrows for bikers riding with the flow of traffic. You know I'm not really a fan of sharrows, but if that's the price to pay for getting a clear contraflow lane in the opposite direction, I think that's a fair trade. Safety-wise, the issue here is probably pretty obvious. These bike lanes can get shoehorned into streets that really aren't very wide. With lane width limited, the contraflow lane is pretty narrow, squeezed between moving vehicles and parked vehicles. This is why the other direction only gets sharrows. You'll want to take your time here in case a parked car pulls out unexpectedly, and if you're comfortable with it, you want to ride out into the lane a bit. That way, oncoming traffic can see you and give you space. Or at least that's how it should work in theory. This car on Sunnyside was disregarding the bike lane and took a while to recognize a biker, me, coming in the opposite direction. This is going to be most common in newer contraflow lanes, where drivers just aren't used to seeing bikes. All of this leads to a more stressful bike lane experience than normal, but take your time and you'll be fine. Remember, it's just a block or two, and it's still better than riding against traffic with no lane at all. And it's especially nice when you find a quiet section with no vehicles. One thing that's not quite as nice is the time it takes for Google Maps to update. Even though the Sunnyside lane is more than a year old, Google doesn't recognize that you can bike west here. Instead, it wants you to take a block north, then back down an alley, then through the park for a bit. Here's hoping the maps in your area don't take quite so long to update. This category sort of fits between the first two. These aren't arterial commuting routes, but they're considerably longer than the short connectors that bridge a gap of only a block or two. In Chicago, they're called neighborhood greenways, and they can utilize standard bike lanes, but often they utilize contraflow lanes. In your city, these could be called bike boulevards. Basically, these quieter residential streets feature limited traffic, lower speed limits, and speed bumps or other traffic calming adjustments to slow down vehicles and make the ride less stressful for people on bikes. A couple great examples are the Berto Greenway and the Glenwood Greenway, both on Chicago's north side. Berto was the city's first ever neighborhood greenway, built a decade ago. It was met with the expected neighborhood resistance, and the final design wasn't really what either side wanted. But what got built was good enough to provide proof of concept that this type of design could work in neighborhoods around the city. The entire east-west greenway currently covers a mile from Lincoln to Clark, connecting to bike lanes on either end and featuring not one but two separate contraflow sections. An additional one-block contraflow extension to the west is currently being built, connecting to the eventual neighborhood greenway on Levitt, also designed with some contraflow features. Glenwood's north-south greenway, a bit further north, has an uninterrupted contraflow section running for 3/4 of a mile, part of an overall route that currently stretches 1.5 miles along quiet, tree-lined streets. Like Berto, the Glenwood Greenway will also be extended, connecting to some other contraflow lanes on Greenview and Farwell, eventually providing a neighborhood greenway route all the way to Evanston. As you might expect, the designation as Neighborhood Greenway means that these streets are designed to be safer for all users. Although you still need to be alert at all times, and it takes a while to mentally adjust to riding against traffic, these are generally comfortable for most bike riders. The length of the contraflow lanes means drivers should be expecting bikes to be here, with a consistent street design block after block. Still, there are going to be some times where a little extra vehicle traffic exists, and it feels a little tight. And even on the quietest of quiet streets, without a moving car in sight, where your mind might start to wander a bit, this can happen. Yeah, it goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. You always have to watch out for doors. Maybe you'd argue this doesn't deserve its own category at all, but I have some footage I want to share, so I'm going to call it a category. Back downtown on Dearborn, the contraflow lane is supposed to cross the river and continue north for another block. Here's what it usually looks like, and if you ask Google Maps for directions, it will tell you to cross on over. Well, that's not possible, at least not right now. They've been doing construction on that bridge for about a year, so they built a protected contraflow lane along Wacker. Southbound bikes can connect at Clark. But Clark is one way south, you say. What about the northbound bikes? Don't worry, my friends. The fine folks of the Chicago Department of Transportation have got you covered. Simply turn right and follow a one-way lane across the bridge. Take another right at the next street, and soon you're back on Dearborn. The safety profile here is pretty interesting. The block on Wacker is truly protected. It's not practical and perhaps cost prohibitive, but I'd love for all barrier-protected lanes to have this level of protection. Look at that wall. The Clark Street Bridge, on the other hand, this lane is technically protected, and these are bascule bridges that need to move, so expecting more probably isn't realistic. My tip for this specific area is to wait if Clark has a green light, and go when the Clark traffic is stopped, as it was here. For detour lanes more generally, taking your time is the best advice I can give. It's a detour, after all. Everyone's going to be a little confused about who should be where and when. Going a little slower than usual will ensure you get from point to point safely. And really, that's the safety situation with all contraflow lanes. They can be very useful, but because they're still somewhat new and unusual, it's best to slow down a bit, giving yourself and drivers extra time to see each other and adjust if necessary. So what are you seeing in your cities and neighborhoods? Are contraflow lanes making your bike commuting or recreational riding more convenient, or safer, or more enjoyable? Or are you a driver muttering under your breath every time you see a bike riding against traffic on a one-way street? Let me know in the comments if you've seen any good or bad examples of contraflow lanes where you live. And if you enjoyed this video, please feel free to subscribe and check out my other videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.